The Dark Knight Returns is an interesting comic book story, subversive in many ways, such as its portrayal of Superman, which is somewhat of a point of controversy. Superman is of course the American icon, with admirable traits meant to set the example of ideal morality for American culture to adhere to. But in The Dark Knight Returns, Superman is framed as an antagonist to the main character of the story, Batman, embodying an opposing philosophy for how to help the world. Since Batman is the main character of this story, and Superman a force which stands in his way, we're implicitly invited to side with Batman's mission and condemn Superman for his opposition to it. But something the story does so well is present the perspectives of each of these characters in a way that allows us to understand their motivations. Not only is this the case, but it's also not actually that clear cut that Batman is even in the right in this story. In fact, there's ample context to form a very strong case against Batman's methods. And not only that, but to form a strong case in favour of the position Superman takes in this story. For this video, I'll be drawing from both the original Dark Knight Returns comic book story and the animated movie adaptation. So let's get into it. The case in favour of Batman's Crusade is fairly obvious on the surface. He lives in a broken system, his city is swamped by crime, and the legal system is not sufficient to solve the problem. So Batman steps in to pick up that slack. It's no surprise why people assume Batman to be the hero of this story, and Superman to be on the wrong side. Batman's path is just more romantic and adventurous. Everyone wants to be the rebel who makes their own rules and gives a middle finger to the system. Because of that, Superman's role of maintaining the system doesn't have a rebellious spirit. It doesn't seem like an exciting adventure to embark on, and furthermore, can be actively criticised when the government he's working for does so many questionable things. But there's a reason we promote order and cooperation in society, and not the chaos of atomised individuals running around, recklessly making up their own rules. In the real world, there are many reasons we don't recommend dressing up like an animal and going out to beat people up. Not only is it dangerous for anyone doing it, but it also destabilises society by encouraging other people to follow that example of taking the power out of the state's hands. Of course, taking power out of the state's hands is part of the reason for Batman's activity. The government, the institutions which are supposed to maintain order and enact justice, are not serving their purpose. So Bruce deems it the responsibility of individuals to step in and do the work themselves. Although Bruce isn't present for this, the ethos he embodies is illustrated quite nicely with the scene where apartment buildings are on fire, and Jim Gordon tells the fighting, rioting masses that they all need to be the ones to put the fire out, because the fire department isn't coming. This stops the citizens fighting amongst themselves, and leads to them each contributing individual assets to this project, ultimately working together to put the fire out. Old-fashioned community is strengthened through the process of encouraging people to work for their own needs, work to preserve their own society, rather than allowing institutions to have a monopoly on that role. Those institutions are shown to repeatedly fail. The fire department does eventually turn up to finish putting the fires out, but it's late doing so. Under Batman's ethos, people should not be encouraged to just wait indefinitely for institutions to come along and fix their problems, because they may never come, or may be so late arriving that the damage is already done. The apartments have already burnt down. The establishment defender version of Superman in this story is essentially what the Avengers are in the MCU. While they may have internal disagreements about adhering to government mandates, and members may break off into more rebellious sects, overall the history of the Avengers through their films is that of a group in league with the establishment. They've been accused of being figures of US military propaganda for this reason. Their pro-establishment ethos is all embedded in the texture of the stories. It's something you're rarely given any reason to question, apart from in Civil War and a few other parts of some of the films. This is essentially the hero-establishment dynamic The Dark Knight Returns draws attention to with Superman. The Dark Knight Returns puts the character into the real world, so that he can no longer be in league with the government. government, but have the bad and uncomfortable consequences of that alliance sanitized and obscured to the audience. No longer can he be both the American icon and have his hands clean of all the blood America sheds around the world. If a figure like Superman really existed, The Dark Knight Returns makes the argument that his choices would plausibly follow this path of subservience to his government, so they trust him, and so he can keep the peace as a result of that. The alternative is the path of radical individualism Batman takes, but for a character like Superman to take that path, there would be greater ramifications than a mere mortal doing so. The world may view this radical individualist Superman as a terrifying threat. Batman is already deemed this way, but at least he doesn't send the world into existential terror and panic, because they assume he can be stopped if necessary. That's not the case with Superman, and he fears the result of adopting methods similar to Batman could lead to humanity destroying itself. He communicates all these fears through his soliloquy when he's caught in the explosion of the nuclear missile he directs away from the Earth. What a crushing existential burden that would be to bear, one which only the strongest being on Earth could manage. In the fantastic world of a superhero story, Batman's vigilante crusade is considered cool and admirable by many real-world superhero fans. But in the real world, most reasonable people would never recommend or endorse his activity. They'd fervently condemn it as criminal violence, endangering the public. A lot of these types of critiques are even raised in the Dark Knight Returns story itself. In reality, most reasonable people would actually recommend something more in line with the stance Superman takes in this story, where he maintains order by acting in accordance with the legal system, with permission from and collaboration with the president of his country. That kind of behaviour actually is the norm now in real democratic society. It's what we recommend to each other generally, even if only implicitly. So, in taking the path he does, it can be argued Superman is acting far more responsibly than Batman, who's inciting violence through the example he sets. People directly follow that example and copy what he does. When having these discussions about state power and individual autonomy, the topic of fascism often creeps in. The Dark Knight Returns is a story which has particularly attracted discussions around fascism over the years. Superman's attempt to maintain order and defend the state is something which can attract accusations that he represents a fascist ethos. Although, more so than that, Batman tends to be accused of being a fascist icon in this story, which is quite a strange accusation, given the actions he takes, but that's a discussion for another video. Is Superman's behaviour in this story in any way fascist? Well, he certainly does some questionable deeds at the bidding of the US government, involving acts of force, but there's no real indication that his intention behind it all ever has any tyrannical motivations. Working to defend the integrity of the state, as Superman does, is not necessarily fascist in itself, especially if you don't have a fascist state. A democratic state is worth protecting. But the right methods have to be used to defend democracy, because certain methods could end up being the tools of destruction for it. Working in defence of the state above the defence of individual autonomy can lean more towards fascism than a more anarchist style of individualism, such as Batman acts in service of. Also, if you have a bad state, which Frank Miller implies is the case in The Dark Knight Returns, then working to defend it could easily be interpreted as more fascistic than working to undermine it. From an anarchist perspective, the state is inherently problematic because it inevitably exerts coercive control over people. This puts Superman in a bit of a lose-lose situation, because if he works to show he's an ally of the state so that he can maintain some level of global stability as the official face of America, he's accused of being fascist. But if he were to take the radical individualist path of Batman, where he separates himself from the state and acts from outside it completely autonomously, not only could that destabilise the global order, because governments may feel threatened by his potential to act against their interests, but his independence as a crusader of justice would inevitably place him as the world's ultimate authority figure. Everything would come down to his personal value judgment. He'd be the king at the top of civilization, and through wielding such self-granted authority, would certainly be accused of fascism there too, just like Batman is for taking his path. Not only does Batman's activity have the potential to incite violence from other citizens, but his presence provokes response from the story's villains. Joker comes out of his vegetative state as a direct response to Batman coming back on the scene after a long retirement. Batman's crusade is arguably shown to be largely more about his own ego than what's actually best for his city. This is communicated repeatedly throughout the story. For example, when he decides to leave the safety of his tank to fight the mutant leader hand to hand, and when he defeats Superman and gives that speech to him about remembering the one man who beat him. Clearly, that's very important to Bruce's ego to have that win. But really, it's actually a rather petty thing to be so concerned with. There's no indication Superman even cares about such petty things. He has grander concerns for the whole of global civilization, which he's trying to hold together with his cautious actions. He's not obsessed with thinking about himself and who he can and can't beat in a fight. Although Bruce tells him to remember that defeat in all his private moments, I think, based on the way Superman is generally portrayed in this story, it wouldn't haunt him as Bruce dreams it may. In fact, I don't think Superman would give it much thought at all, beyond the personal implications it had for his relationship with Bruce and wider society. Superman's ethos is an almost entirely outward-looking one, while Bruce's is largely inward-looking. If someone had given that same speech to Bruce after defeating him in a fight, I think it really would have haunted his thoughts constantly in all his private moments. He did get defeated by the mutant leader, and in spite of it being ill-advised, he went back for round 2 with him, seemingly not only because of the cleansing influence for Gotham taking down such a symbol of societal rot would have, and did have, but also because Bruce just couldn't bear the torment of defeat. Rather than a story about Batman's correct philosophy triumphing over Superman's incorrect philosophy, I think The Dark Knight Returns is far more complex than that. In spite of Frank Miller's personal politics, the work articulates endorsements and critiques of the methods and ideologies of both these heroes, and actually provides enough context for you to justify picking either of their sides in the conflict. Through this story, we're shown that there are trade-offs with each of the two paths of heroism presented. As with so many things, the key is finding the right balance. The ethos Batman represents of encouraging self-reliance and giving a reminder that the state is there to serve its people rather than control them is a good thing to promote. When institutions lose touch with what they were put in place for, perhaps they need the kind of challenge Batman puts to them to bring them back into line. However, it's also worth remembering that consistently subverting the societal norms of civility and official legal process could quite easily have far more negative consequences for society than those committing such actions may intend. If democracy is worth preserving, then, in a democratic state, the sentiment behind Superman's actions to maintain societal cooperation and a degree of order is not unreasonable. It's just a matter of how far it's pushed. And arguably, in this story, Batman and Superman stop each other from going too far. But anyway, what do you think? Is there any legitimate defence to be made of Superman's actions in The Dark Knight Returns? Or is he definitively on the wrong side? Let me know in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. See you next time.